Hi everyone, Professor McKinnon here. For those of you that weren't in class today, we had a fire drill that interrupted my lecture. I've done some very creative video editing though, and I'm getting really good at it, so I just want you to pay very close attention throughout the video and see if you can tell where the split happens from when I was presenting in class till when I was recording afterwards. I'm quite proud of it. I think it's quite subtle.
Okay. Apologies for the slight delay there. Had a bit of a panic moment because I forgot to upload my slides to my Google Drive. But got them here. And yeah. Before I start, are there any questions about anything to do with the course? Anything? Just checking in. Everyone feeling healthy despite the apocalyptic nature of our COVID numbers? Ha ha ha. Alrighty. So first, I'm going to go into a question that was asked. I can't remember if it was during the lecture or if it was someone who came up to the desk, but it was a fantastic question. I had a terrible answer. I've researched it and have an even more terribler answer, which is great. And then we're going to take stock of the world of the gods that we've read up to now. And then I'm going to jump into really what amounts to a giant exposition dump of the names of gods, things they're associated with, and some fun pictures. Today is perhaps not the funnest lecture, but I will try to make it as entertaining as possible by telling you terrible things that gods do. So, what was that question? Did women watch Greek theater? Were women invited, allowed, or did they attend Greek theater? I supposed no, but I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. And so, like a good academic, I researched it and found out that academics have been arguing over this question for over 500 years. So that's a fantastic question. I think actually it may have been you that asked it, but I think it came from this side of the room. There's arguments against, arguments saying, well, it costs money to go to the theater, and women wouldn't be allowed to spend money. And there's general restrictions on the mobility of women, especially in Athens, and so that's why they wouldn't have been able to attend. And then there's arguments for. Uh, Long story short, unless you have a secret police that is in every corner of the world all the time, it's really, really hard to police this stuff. So if you're asking, should women have been allowed to attend? The answer could have been no. But can we say definitively they didn't? Well, who knows? Because that is just really hard to police. And anecdotal evidence from the sources themselves seem to suggest that either women were in the audience or women were an audience at some time for these plays. So this, as I said, this argument has gone back and forth over and over for over 500 years. And it also doesn't begin to recognize that there are class and location features to this whole debacle. Class features, it is always, how to put this? Women in elite positions have more to lose by stepping out of line. And so if women are not allowed to go to the theater, elite women would be the ones most likely to be restricted. And non-elite women would probably just do whatever they want anyway. And location factors, what's true in Athens definitely is not true outside of Athens. What's true in Sparta is not true outside of Sparta. And you have tons, hundreds, if not thousands, of rural theater performances, as well as other urban centers. So this complicates the discussion and really makes it boil down to, oh, but the general consensus, the academic consensus right now is they probably attended, but this is ultimately an unknowable thing. That it's one of those things from history that we cannot definitively come down one way or the other. We can look at the appropriate evidence and make a decision, knowing that that decision is an opinion based on fact, not a fact in and of itself. So, any questions on the response to this question? Yeah, you and then you. Yeah. specifically for women. Oh, now this is getting into even more stuff I don't know. um, because we don't know for certain if women even attended theater performances in general, I would surmise from that there isn't one that we know of for sure was like, oh, this is the women's play, or the women's performance. But that again is a guess. So anything goes. When you're dealing with, we give the broad term of ancient Greece or ancient Greek culture, but ultimately that is academic term that is flattening out the Greeks. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different polis and rural areas. It is impossible to say for sure that there wasn't one somewhere somehow. So yeah, I'd say a firm maybe. And here, yeah. Yes, so unknowable within the confines of our current realm of knowledge. If new evidence came forward, then definitely possible to be knowable. It's one of the reasons why archaeology, because we can dig up new stuff. Oh, it's impossible to give a specific number, but like I like to punish or torture and or enlighten my students with every single time we dig, we are every day at 6 in the morning engaging in groundbreaking research. I would like a collective groan from the audience, but yeah, so that's that every day. Every day you turn up something new, and there's always a possibility, no matter what, because if a scenario, let's say that you're excavating in an open field, and this open field looks agricultural, and it looks like it's been agricultural for 2,000 years. And you start going down, and all of a sudden you find that 2,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago, or 2,500 years ago, it was not agricultural. It was, in fact, a shrine or a theater or something along those lines. You find evidence that you didn't expect. This happens literally every day. So that's one of the exciting things about archaeology. There's a whole lot that we do expect, that we do find, but you never know until you dig, and that's one of the reasons why continued excavation is a research goal. No problem. Yeah. Yeah, so this is an excellent paradigm to discuss individual power and collective power. So as an elite, I'm an elite woman. And I want to go to the theater. And for whatever reason, let's pretend that we know for sure that my city state or my society is like, no, no women. And I want to go, and I demand. My husband is an incredibly powerful magistrate, and I demand that he find a way that we can go to the theater. Or you know what? Screw him. I'm going alone. That only takes you so far, because you must belong. You have power, you have money, and you have influence in so much as others will work with you in that way until you become so overwhelmingly powerful that you can just bowl over others. And to the best of our knowledge, that happens rarely in the Greek world that we are discussing in this time period. In the classical period, the archaic period, you get elite people, you get powerful people, but they are relative to each other in their own realm on the same level. And if one steps out of line, they can kind of circle the wagons against them. And one individual does not necessarily get overwhelming power over everyone else. Even in monarchical polis, so they have a king, that is not an absolute power. There's always a negotiation of give and take. Does that answer your question? Cool. Okay, you, and then one more if there's another one. If I didn't know about women, Yeah, that's another scenario of I just don't know.
And I would just assume off of that someone would have to at least watch over the children. Maybe women could go, but just because their husbands were like, I'm leaving, I'm taking the day off, they were stuck with the children, even depending on how young and how often they would have kids.
Again, this does bring into question elite status or non-elite status, because if you're an elite woman, the last thing you're going to do is look after your kids. You've got weaving to do. That's really important. So you have slaves, or you have individuals that look after your kids on an hourly basis, tend to their needs. You only really care about them when they grow up and get power and put influence on their own. And a non-elite woman, that could factor into it as well, but really going into a realm that I don't have an answer. And based on the debate and the 500 years of history of this debate, I don't think scholarship, at least currently, has an answer for that. Okay, one more. If there's maybe somebody at the back. I begged last time. Do you want me to beg again? And I might pick you at random. Wouldn't that be terrifying? Thank you. I'm sorry, I only caught about half of that. Could you speak up a little bit louder? That is a safe assumption, because even if women are in attendance, they're not the key demographic. There may be, based on the anecdotal evidence from a variety of plays, there may have been instances where a joke is said to the side that the women would, participate in or know or get. But ultimately, yes, you're correct. This is men writing for men to talk with other men. Cool. All right. So that was a fantastic question. I decided to do a slide on it. Let us jump into the material. So, what's going on in the world of the gods? We finished the theogony largely. I've given you some Apollodorus readings as well. And ultimately, Zeus is God in heaven. He is king. And there is an established order of the gods. But what does that mean exactly? Who are the gods, and who's in this pecking order? And I bring up again from Hestia the inverse storytelling. Hesiod wrote the Theogony, and this is a fairly early source, if you remember. He wrote the Theogony assuming that his audience already knew the world as it is at the end of the Theogony, that Zeus is in power, that there's a set number of Olympians, and he's just filling in the gaps and adding extra material to stories people already knew. So effectively, you need to know the story before you can read the story to get the full context. And the only way to do that is, I guess, be an ancient Greek, or have studied this immensely before you started reading the sources. So, what does this mean for today's lecture, and what does this mean for the established order? There's many names. There's lots of characters here. There's tons and tons and tons. It is a vast divine world with many interrelationships, and these interrelationships between the gods and other gods, gods and mortals, mortals and gods, get more complicated over time, because new relationships come out of the woodwork, and gods that once were separate get merged over time. It's all wonderful and complicated. But this is also a mirror of the world around you. So the world of the elite is vast. There are tons of interrelationships. And while this is not a direct one-to-one correspondence, again, we have a kind of allegorical representation that the ruling classes definitely want to identify with the gods, and not as much. Definitely happens in the Greek world, but when we get into the Roman period, this happens all the time. And there is a strong connection of equating one particular royal family or elite family with a divine heritage. And so this allegorical relationship is something to keep in mind. So, who do we have here? The first generation of Olympians. This is, I have labeled this first generation. Basically, they were born first, not that they lived there before. I guess they had to if they are born first. But anyway, not important. Just know that there's kind of multiple stages of Olympians. And these are the kids of Kronos and Rhea. You've met these folks, or at least you've seen their names. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, and Aphrodite. And I've got an asterisk on Aphrodite because Hesiod, if you recall, Hesiod describes Aphrodite's birth arising out of a certain castration event. And that is the most common version of that myth. But Aphrodite is given a different origin, that she is a child of other gods. I think even in Homer, so something as equally as old as Hesiod. So just know that Aphrodite can fit in the first generation or the second generation. And because it works narratively, I'm going to talk about her in the second generation. Yeah. Hades is absolutely a child of Kronos and Rhea, but where does Hades live? He doesn't live in Olympus. So this is something that we will be covering actually on Friday. But definitely a good thing to bring up. Hades, why isn't he on this list? Because he doesn't live on Olympus, and that means he's not an Olympian. That's really ultimately what Olympian means. Someone who lives on Olympus. This is effectively the palace or royal capital of Zeus, and Zeus gets to be the arbiter of who's allowed to live there and who's not. This is a photo of Mount Olympus, just in case you wanted to see it, where we have our Greek summer archaeology. I forget exactly what the project is called. It's in Thessaly. If that project starts up again, you can see Mount Olympus. You can visit it if you so desire, as part of your work and toil as an archaeologist. Dr. Marguerite Hagsma is your contact. Again, try to toss out references to the department. So, this first generation. Who is Zeus? I mean, we've talked a lot about Zeus. So some of this is going to be review, but for those of you who may have been confused, perhaps you didn't know who these gods were, or knew the name, but like nothing else, that's why this lecture exists, to kind of fill in those gaps. Ultimately, Zeus is a sky god, and he is a god of kings as well as the king of the gods. He has multiple marriages. We've gone over some of these. They're interesting. Metis, who he consumes and absorbs Mega Man style, and Themis, and then Hera, his eternal wife. And sources talk to us and tell us that his marriage with Hera is actually somewhat, I forget the exact term, the golden wedding or something along those lines. It is special and somewhat eternal, almost raising to the level of a divinity in and of itself, the concept, the abstract noun of their wedding, of their marriage. Somewhat at odds with this, Zeus has numerous affairs. He likes to, as I said last time, get busy. And as part of these affairs, Zeus goes through a number of animal transformations. He turns himself into a swan. He turns himself into an ox. He turns himself into all kinds of animal creatures to, if we're being kind, seduce women. If we're being accurate, force himself upon women. So, what kind of imagery is associated with Zeus? As we've discussed before, it's lightning bolts. You see a guy holding a bunch of lightning bolts, that's Zeus. That's the key factor right there. He's typically bearded as well, but lightning bolts is a dead giveaway. Other names he's known by is Chronides and Chronion. I think I got this mistaken in the lecture before. I may have thought that was Cronus. So just Chronides and Chronion, son of Cronus. I messed up my Greek there. And then in the Roman pantheon, he is Jupiter or Jove. Here's another picture of Zeus. You can tell it's Zeus. Lightning bolts. Okay. We've got Hera. Hera is the wife of Zeus, the eternal wife, and the goddess of marriage. She, as an attribute, is queen of the gods and is revered as such. Part of her imagery involves the royal lotus scepter. So she carries a scepter with a lotus at the top. That is a typical attribute of Hera. And she is very frequently crowned or wears a diadem in art. You can see the diadem here and her scepter. She has other names. In the Roman pantheon. She is Juno. So Juno is the wife of Jupiter. Hera is the wife of Zeus. And she has a reputation of being jealous. Now, I've put scare quotes around jealous because, as we've gone at great length to discuss already, the Greek world is not exactly super positive on women. Hera doesn't like her man running around having affairs all the time, forcing himself on women. And because she tries to get even with him, she's just a jealous bitch. And, I mean, that doesn't sound like she's the bad guy there. But our sources tend to take that mood. If not a straight-up villain, she's definitely characterized as being unreasonable. That's probably the best generalization I can give. Another depiction of Hera here. Again, with her scepter. Tiny, tiny, tiny little lotus at the top. And her crown. Poseidon. Poseidon is a god of water and sea. He goes out into saltwater bodies. He is also the god of earthquakes. You saw in a few of our sources he's called the Earth Shaker. I'm not sure if that qualifies as an epithet, if it would be Poseidon Earth Shaker, or if it would just be another name. He is the Earth Shaker. But just know that Poseidon, water, earthquakes. Aphrodite is his wife, and he is associated with the trident. That's a three-pronged spear, and sea creatures. He is very, very frequently depicted riding a chariot, pulled by sea creatures, as you see here. And because of this, in both Greece and then to a larger extent Rome, he kind of becomes a god of horses or a god of almost chariot races. So I haven't put that on there, but that's something that you should probably know. Is he's associated with horses and chariots, and he goes by Neptune in the Roman pantheon. Just as I've mentioned in the past, these are not one-to-one equations. They are broadly equivalent. So Neptune is Poseidon, but also, depending on the context, isn't. So just, it's important to keep that in mind. There are some stories that Neptune does, that Poseidon doesn't, and vice versa, and that goes for all of the gods. None of them are identical in every respect at all times. And also, Poseidon is not the only water god for the Greeks. You've got his kid, Triton, and then a whole host, Oceanus, Tethys, like just tons of them. But this is the first generation of those that live on Olympus, the Olympians that we're going over. Here is an interesting depiction of Poseidon riding a hippocamp. It's a whale horse, basically. So this also qualifies as a, what's the name of that subreddit? Confusing perspective. So it totally looks like Poseidon has the sea monster tail here. But if you can see towards the bottom, his foot is sticking out of the bottom of the belly of the hippocamp. He is riding it like it's a horse. Yeah, see? Huh? The black on black, doesn't help. So yeah, he's just riding that. His son, Triton. Triton is actually often depicted more half monster, half person. So he's got it's like a merman kind of thing. And in fact, tritones, so tritons, are kind of iconographic images that appear in art. So his son can be depicted as a specific individual named Triton, or just as kind of this abstract a Triton, and there's a bunch of them out there. Demeter, goddess of agriculture, grain, and bread, and a whole bunch of other stuff. These are just the kind of Cole's notes of these different gods and goddesses. Demeter is associated with a mystery cult. These are called the Ellucian Mysteries. And that's because they take place at a place called Eleusis. The Ellucian Mysteries are, you may have heard the term mystery cult before, and this is all over our scholarship. And the best way to take that term is it is a cult that we don't know a great deal about. Above and beyond that becomes a lot of conjecture and a lot of speculation. But we do know, what little we do know, is that these rites and traditions were kept within the cult. They weren't for everybody. You had to be inducted into the Ellucian Mysteries in order to know their secrets. So they claimed to have some knowledge of the world, of the universe, and to be inducted into the mysteries would mean that you were considered worthy enough to learn about these things. Demeter has imagery associated with her, namely a cornucopia. That's that vase-looking thing you guys holding. And a grain sheaf or wheat sheaf. She has some other names. Deo and Ceres, or Keras, is a Roman name. What modern word, based on the Roman name, do you think we might have in English? I heard a whole bunch of people say it, so I want to hear it louder. Exactly. That's why we call it cereal. That's why we call them cereals, because of the gods, or this particular goddess. Yeah. That's a great question. It's morphologically quite similar to Deus. Like it just morphologically, the word looks a lot like God, but it's not. So she's just the goddess. I don't know of other associations beyond that. Sorry. Any other questions? Yeah. So that's a great question. The answer is sure, because particularly the Ellucian Mysteries. This is the oldest mystery cult that we're aware of. It is popular. It is popular as in people know of it and respect it. It has history and tradition on its side. And so while I'm not aware of direct influence from the Ellucian Mystery, I mean, I'm probably wrong here, but just the influence would be had is if you get inducted. If you personally, as an elite member of society, get inducted into the Ellucian Mysteries, that reflects very well upon you. That's a good thing. That's a feather in your cap to say, I was considered respectable enough and righteous enough to be granted, and perhaps wise enough, to be granted this ancient wisdom. And that's a lot of the ways in which these various groups can influence society at large. not necessarily through direct interaction, but through granting of prestige. Yep. No. The Knights Templar. So the Knights Templar are formed explicitly as a crusading military order in a specific place at a specific time. They don't exist beforehand, and they only exist for a period of time afterwards. Once the Crusades, the military endeavors in the Middle East fail catastrophically, they kind of lose their reason for being. They get turned into bankers, and then someone wants to call in their debts, and they get destroyed. And then over centuries, we've turned them into this kind of mystery cult. But they were not that. This was a mystery cult, but it's not. We overemphasize. We as a society today overemphasize the mystery part. It is perfectly reasonable in the ancient world that you wouldn't share knowledge, that you would have specific knowledge and you would deem others unworthy to know it. We look at that and think, oh, this must have been strange and weird, and they did all kinds of strange rites and so on. I mean, they probably did strange rites, but that's because everyone did strange rites. But yeah, sorry, that's a bit of an aside. Okay, any other? I think, yeah.
So how exactly was Demeter associated with that? Was she like kind of the source of the ancient wisdom?
Oh, the Ellucian Mysteries are a cult to Demeter. Demeter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, if I didn't make that clear. Yeah, they have at Eleusis. There's a temple to Demeter. They do sacrifices and rites for her, and that's why she's associated with it. And being that she's a goddess of agriculture and harvest and grain and bread and all these sorts of things, it's very easy to see how this cult would have been around for a long time, because it's super important that you get the harvest in, because otherwise people starve. Okay, one more, yeah.
So I'm just clarifying this cult that was run by like
Oh, yeah. Whenever you hear reference to an ancient cult, this is this is an actual physical thing that existed, that people participated in, that you could get inducted into. It is not a or not exclusively something that exists in myth. Okay. Another picture of Demeter, wheat sheaf, and so on. She looks kind of masculine there. Hestia. Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. She is a household goddess as well as a city goddess. This is the hearth. Is that a fire alarm?
As I was saying, we've got Hestia here. So Hestia is a goddess of the hearth, and a hearth is basically the center of your home. It's a cooking fire, it's a heating fire, and there is both a hearth for the home, for the individual family, and a hearth for the state, for the city, for your group of people. And so Hestia gets to be both a public and a private goddess. She gets to tend the hearth of both your city-state, say Athens, and your home, your individual home. And Hestia is the firstborn of Kronos and Rhea. So of this first generation of Olympians, she is actually the eldest of all of them. And if you remember our birth story, what that means is since she was the firstborn, she is the first consumed, and then she is also the last disgorged. She's the last that gets spit up. And so in a way, she gets to be both the eldest and the youngest of the first generation there. She is also another one of our virginal goddesses. She doesn't get married, she doesn't have kids, and this is important to kind of go along with, if you see on the imagery there, the idea of modesty. Now, this is, again, if we've gone to great pains to talk about this, a different sense of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a proper or good woman. And so being a virgin goes along with this modesty aspect of her visual appearance. So what do I say veiled, but she's not wearing a veil there. And in the modern sense of the veil, we often talk about, say, a niqab, where you veil the front of your face. But in this particular instance, it is a veil that goes over the hair, and I'll show you in the next image. The the importance of this veil comes from sacrifices. So you need to cover portions of your body in order to perform the sacrifice appropriately. And Hestia exemplifies this concept of doing things appropriately. So if she is going to be engaging in a sacrifice, she absolutely will veil her hair. This is the Greek model of appropriate religious action. And otherwise, she is dressed fully. So she's not depicted like Aphrodite, where Aphrodite is often nude. That is not on for Hestia. She also is on occasion depicted with a kettle. I couldn't find one for this particular presentation, but a kettle in the Greek world is just going to look like another pot. So she can be depicted with a ceramic pot. And the kettle, of course, is you boil water on the home hearth. So these are linked in that way. Other names for Hestia, the most common one that we come across in our literature is Vesta. So Vesta is her Latin name, her Roman name. And there is a specific cult associated with Vesta that is integral to the Roman state. We'll definitely talk more about this in our Roman section, but Vestal virgins, if you've ever heard of that, those are specific young girls that are they are brought into a cult for tending the hearth of Rome. They become virgins alongside of Vesta and participate in sacrifices for the goodness of the state. So that's something that we get to go into a little bit more detail during the Roman period. There is no state cult of Hestia virgins that I'm aware of in the Greek world, but there is later on in the Roman world. So we've got here this image of Hestia, and you can see her hair is covered, and this is because she has engaged in a sacrifice, and she is appropriately attired. She is veiled for the purposes of this sacrifice. And this is not just for women. You veil in Greek sacrifice to show appropriateness, whether you're male or female. And we will see during the Roman period, Romans do not veil for their sacrifices. It's just not a standard that they adhere to. But you will see depictions of Roman emperors or Roman figures that veil for a sacrifice. And this is known as they're doing it in the Greek style. So for a Roman sacrifice, it would be inappropriate to veil for some activity, for a sacrifice. But if a Roman is doing a sacrifice in Greece or for a Greek cult or expressing piety in the Greek world, it's perfectly reasonable that they would veil, because it's understood that you got to adhere to the standards and practices of the culture that you are participating in. So again, this is just to illustrate some of the modesty expressed in Hestia imagery. So that finishes our first generation of Olympians, and then we can jump into the second generation. So as I mentioned before, you'll know second on this list is Aphrodite. That asterisk is because Aphrodite, depending on the story we're listening to, can be qualified as the first generation or the second generation. I have included her here mostly for her association with Ares. It helps for me in a narrative sense, but just again to kind of explain why that asterisk is on there. And also, if she's included in the second generation of Olympians, that's because she is the daughter of Zeus and Dione. If she is included in the first generation of Olympians, that is because she's the product of the castration of Kronos. And so the only child that we have in the second generation of Olympians that is of the marriage of Zeus and Hera is Ares. Ares is it in terms of the Olympian gods, specific child of Zeus and Hera. As I mentioned, Aphrodite is in some sources a child of Zeus and Dione. Zeus and Leto produces the twins Apollo and Artemis, and this is there's very famous depictions of Zeus turning himself into a swan to seduce Leto. And then Zeus and Semele produce Dionysius, so that is another one of our Olympian gods here. And then we move on to Zeus and Maia producing Hermes. Zeus and Metis producing Athena, and then Hera spontaneously producing Hephaestus on her own. So Ares, he's the god of war. And if you need to know one thing other than the fact that he is the god of war, it is that he has a famous affair with Aphrodite. So Aphrodite gets married to Hephaestus. So Hephaestus and Aphrodite are a pair, and there's somewhat of a contrast here because Hephaestus is physically disabled. Sometimes he's shown with a lame leg. And Aphrodite is the most beautiful of all the beautiful that is ever beautiful. And so the idea that absolute beauty is paired up with a god who is not absolute beauty, and in fact has a deformity. There is something being said there in terms of the construct of the divine realm. But Aphrodite is seduced by Ares. Ares constant engaging in warfare, and so Aphrodite seems to come out okay from this affair. I mean, Hephaestus is obviously angry, and he captures them in golden nets and does some interesting stuff. But Ares, as a result, and also because of his warlike nature, everybody hates Ares except for Aphrodite. And so all of the other gods look upon him and kind of recoil a little bit. He's that angry guy that you don't necessarily want to have a long-term conversation with. For imagery, Ares is almost universally associated with that martial helm, that helmet there. If you see a god and that's the only thing that you can tell about them, you can be almost assured that it is Ares. And if you see someone saying it's Ares without the helm, there better be some very compelling reasons. He's, got to have an axe chopping off somebody's head or something along those lines. And then he has some other names associated with him. So Enelios is a name that gets associated with Ares, but if we go back to our linear B sources, so our earliest sources on Greek mythology, Enelios is actually Ares's son. And at some point when those sources were written down, and it may have been that at that time this merger had already happened as well, but long story short, Enelios is associated as a name for Ares, and it no longer comes to mean his son. But this is a scenario where, again, we can have two names for the same god or two names for different gods, and this difference is highlighted. And I mean, it obviously bothers some individuals, but it doesn't bother society at large. They are okay with this ambiguity. And then, of course, his other name is his Roman name. It's Mars. So this is where we get our English word martial from. Ares and Mars share this god of war trait. And here we have a statue of Ares, quite famous statue here, and he's got his helmet on and a spear, and looking quite imposing in a martial stance. Aphrodite is, fairly famously known as the goddess of love, and as I mentioned, she is the wife of Hephaestus. So the famous affair with Ares characterizes the both of them but she is, as I said, more. She gets off a little better, which seems a bit interesting considering women tend to take the brunt of blame in our ancient sources. But because of Ares' association with warfare, that is ultimately why people dislike him, and then the affair is just this added on aspect. And then, of course, her two births. So she is born either from sea foam or from Zeus and Dione. And then in imagery, she is very frequently associated with nudity. So if you see a nude female, especially if she's a nude female on some sea foam or a nude female in a shell or associated with shells, that's almost certainly going to be Aphrodite. And then she is associated with the personification of love, Eros. Um, and in this is if you've ever heard of Cupid, Eros is visually is Cupid. It's a little character with wings, and we over time in the Roman period, Eros, instead of being a single individual, much like I was talking about with Triton, becomes erotes, becomes just you can throw an Eros or two or three or five in an image, and this is where we get the association of Cupid later on. But Eros is an individual in the Greek period that we're studying, and then when we get into the Roman period, erotes or cupids, more than one of them in any one scene at a time. And then for other names for Aphrodite, Cyprus and Cytherea, and then much more famously, Venus is her Roman name. Somewhat of an old, outdated name for sexually transmitted infections or STIs is a venereal disease. You may have heard that from, I mean, at this stage, probably your grandparents. But regardless, if you have ever heard that phrase, that the reference is to Venus and to the goddess of love. And we have her here expressing almost none of those standard images, the associations in the imagery that I was talking about. So just keep in mind that these attributes are generally featured, but they are not absolute laws that they must be present for her to be considered Aphrodite. And in this image here, we have Aphrodite depicted in the nude, but, and this is somewhat important, she is nude but is not flaunting it. And this is a standard characteristic that says probably more about the morality of the culture making the imagery than any narrative within the myth itself. There is an aspect of, and this word is pretty much spot on or on the nose. There's an aspect of titillation here, and the idea is that people want to depict nudes. They like to do so. This is a exciting for them, but you cannot do so and claim to be a moral and upstanding citizen or a moral and upstanding person unless there's some element here. And so Aphrodite has been caught unaware. She was bathing, and so she's trying to cover up, and thus you can get away with showing nudity. Now, there's less anxiety in art over male nudity. Men are generally shown nude and standing proud, for lack of a better term. But with female nudity, there's the standard is to show at least a little bit of hesitancy on behalf of the figure. And this is, again, just telling us about the culture that made the art rather than any particular element to a story from the mythological narrative. Okay, so moving on to Apollo. Apollo is a god of prophecy, but also a god of a whole heck of a lot. The Oracle at Delphi, if you've ever heard anything to do with the Oracle at Delphi, that is a cult center for Apollo. And so he is a god of oracles. But he's also a god of music, of poetry, of healing, of archery. He is very strongly associated with plays and theater in in a similar vein to Dionysus. So these aspects come into play. Apollo is one of these gods that presumably in an earlier time period had fewer associations and then gains more as time goes on, specifically healing. Very, very early on in the Greek world, Apollo is not associated with healing. That is the god Asclepius's domain. However, Apollo gains a healing element, and by the time we're studying our Greeks in the classical period and beyond, he very much has a healing association. Apollo also has solar connotations, so he's not the sun. The sun is a god named Helios, but he is associated with the sun, and he can be depicted with a whole lot of sun imagery. And this comes into play when he is twinned with his sister Artemis, and I'll explain a little bit more, but the long story short is he is associated with the sun and she is associated with the moon. In terms of imagery, he's very frequently, if not always, depicted as a beardless youth, and then he gets a lyre. That's the instrument that this particular Apollo is playing, and he has an a laurel, laurel of oak leaves. So if the very standard, if you've ever seen a kind of crescent of leaves that someone who is wearing in their hair, that is a laurel of oak leaves, and it is strongly, if not definitively, associated with Apollo. Another name that he goes by is Phobos. This is not Phobos, just there's the moons of Mars, Deimos, and Phobos. This is a different name. If I have further confused you, I apologize. But this name is also paired with his sister Artemis, who is known as Phoebe and Phobos. There's another image of Apollo. Again, his male nudity is he does not seem to be concerned with covering it up at all, and he's standing proud, as I said. Okay, so Artemis. As I mentioned, she is the twin sister of Apollo, and she is a goddess of hunting. She is almost always depicted with a bow and arrow. That is a defining characteristic of Artemis. Somewhat, I don't know how to put this, backwards, I suppose, or just different. She's a goddess of childbirth, but she is another one of our virgin goddesses. So she is associated with childbirth, but she does not have children of her own. And then because of her hunting prowess, she is also a goddess of the wilderness. And as I mentioned, she has lunar connotations. She can be depicted as the moon. There is a moon goddess. There is a depiction of the moon. She's Luna in the Roman pantheon. The name in Greek escapes me right now, but just to let you know, just like with Apollo, she is not the personification of the moon, but can be depicted with lunar imagery. And as I said, she has a bow and arrow. She's also often featured with deer or other wild animals. And then, as I said, her other names are Phoebe, and then her Roman name is Diana. So if you watched the recent Wonder Woman movies, her name Diana is very closely associated with the character of Artemis. She's a hunter. There's some virginal aspects, but not so much. But obviously, Wonder Woman is a modern mythological take, not an ancient one, but it takes inspirations from the ancient world. This is just another depiction of Artemis. So we again have her with her quiver and arrows, and then there's a deer here associated with her. Dionysius, fun god of just doing whatever the heck you feel like. So he's the god of wine, pleasure, madness, frenzy, a whole host of other things. These things all sound fabulous, I suppose, but don't take them too lightly. Madness, especially. This is an idea that control is very important. And so if you, in the Greek world, if you stray out of control, if you are behaving outside the bounds of society, This is negative. This is not a good thing. And so Dionysus is an Olympian god. He is venerated. He is worshipped. However, he is understood to be dangerous. He is understood that there, you don't mess around with any of the gods, but Dionysus is particularly dangerous because if you drink too much, then you are going into too deep into the Dionysiac world, so to speak. His wife is Ariadne, and imagery that is associated with him is so he's got here a staff. This is called a thyrsus, and at the top there is a pine cone. So it's a staff topped with a pine cone. It's called a thyrsus. This is an important aspect and attribute of his imagery. He will almost always be depicted either with a thyrsus or with pine cones in his vicinity. He also has satyrs and maenads around him typically. So satyrs are the half goat men, and maenads are women, but they are women in a frenzy, women who are half crazed. He has a retinue of horny goat men and crazed women that follow him around wherever he goes. Dionysus is Carnival, but the divine version. He very frequently, so this is a more slight depiction of Dionysus. So he is depicted somewhat feminine and as a youth, no beard, but he can be depicted as a very happy bearded old man as well. It depends on the time and the place and what is trying to be emphasized in the imagery. Additionally, you can see that he's got a panther here. Wild animals are also strongly associated with Dionysus, and that goes along with the wilderness, madness, and other aspects of his character. Other names include Bacchus and Laius. Bacchus and Bacchic rituals is something that, if you go on in classics, you'll hear this mentioned a lot in our literature, just because these are objects of study. And then in the Roman world, in addition to these Greek names do not go away in the Roman world, but he's also called Liber, and that's freedom. So he has these additional names. Just as a side note, for these Roman names, I believe I mentioned it before, but it's particularly important with Dionysus. In the Roman world, there is a god named Liber. Liber is broadly equivalent to Dionysus. They have many of the same attributes, but they are not always the same. They are the same when it's convenient and different when it's convenient. That being said, someone in the same source may refer to the exact same god as Dionysus and then Bacchus and then Liber. They will leave it up to you to be educated enough to know that those are all of the same character. It can be quite frustrating and impenetrable to the reader, but this is just the way that these sources are written. And then here we have a different example. So if you see, this is the bearded old man example of Dionysus. However, he did at one time still have that thyrsus. You can see he's holding what was a staff. There's only a tiny rod left in his hand. But this would have been a Dionysus statue with a thyrsus at one point in time. Hermes is just an absolutely fantastic god for a lot of reasons. He often in our stories is the go-between, and he's a messenger. He takes messages back and forth. He reports on people. He's a spy, but because of this nature, he actually in art and in public cult gets a host of associations, and I really like Hermes, and I'll try and fit him in as much as we can in terms of looking at imagery and iconography. So things that move are associated with Hermes. So he's a god of herds, he's a god of travelers, and he's a god of trade, and also by association, diplomacy, language, and so on. But he is also, so it says Zeus's herald and messenger, but that word up there that I've got, psychopomp. Now this is a crazy, nonsense, made up academic word, but it is a specific word that we cannot do without. And this is someone who guides you from the living world to the land of the dead. And so, if you're familiar with Norse mythology, um, Valkyries are psychopomps. They take you from the world of the living to the world of the dead. They guide you to Valhalla. And Hermes has this job in the Greek world. He is the go-between. And because of this, he is just the most, you heard me use this phrase earlier in another class, he is the most liminal of the gods. He is infused with liminality. What that means is that he is always in between. He is always almost in two places at once. And that's what liminal means, transitioning from one state to another. I believe I used the example of snakes being a liminal creature where they can live on the ground, but they also burrow underground and they can travel freely between the two. And then of course they shed their skin, and so they can kind of be reborn in a visual sense. Um, so imagery for Hermes, he's got those winged boots, and he also has, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation here because I always mess up the pronunciation, but it is a caudicus. So this is a specific rod. The caudicus is a rod exclusively associated with Hermes, but in our modern day, it has become a little confused, and I'll show you some images to kind of explain what I'm talking about here, because it's a complicated image. Other names include Argiphantes. This is Argus, slayer in a later myth. Hermes slays a king that is associated with the Argolid or Argos, and his Roman name is Mercury. So here's one of the just nonsense crazy associations that Hermes has in art, and it's one of my favorite. This is called a herm, and these would be erected in doorways. They would be paired up in doorways to guide you from one side to the other. And it's an this is not unfinished. This is a complete statue. And what you need to display Hermes is you need genitalia and you need a face and nothing else. And this is the guide who will take you from one room into the next room. And these are everywhere in the ancient world. I just absolutely love these. I believe that they're more strongly associated with the Roman world rather than the ancient Greek one. But Herm statuary is fantastic to me. That you would have these kind of statues that guide you from one room to the next in every single room that you have. So the caudicus, this is a caudicus. You've got a staff with two wings on it and then snakes entwining around. Now, this is from a bank in Toronto. And the idea that you would have a caudicus associated with a bank goes in with Hermes's association with commerce and trade and so on. This makes a lot of sense. But you may recognize this image from other associations, and those associations are medical. So there's another staff from the ancient world called the rod of Asclepius, and it's a staff with a snake on it. And this is a rod of Asclepius on the World Health Organization's official logo. And in some instances, the caudicus is used for medical associations instead of the rod of Asclepius. And this may be a mistake because they are somewhat similar looking objects from the ancient world, but there can also be a perfectly legitimate reason for putting the caudicus on there. And it deals with the association of Hermes as that psychopomp, as the individual that guides you from this world to the next and is expressly associated with liminality. This gets a bit dark, but if you've got an ambulance with a caudicus on it, this somewhat makes sense because the ambulance is both taking you from where you are injured to where you will hopefully get healed, the hospital, but also they they somewhat hold you in the balance of between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So if you see an ambulance with a caducus on it, that's not necessarily a mistake. They didn't necessarily think they should have put a rod of Asclepius on there. This can be a somewhat dark representation of their dual nature as either your savior or your guide to the afterlife. This is just something to think about. Things that you can see in your everyday life and make you tremendously unpopular at dinner parties and just randomly accosting individuals on the side of the street when you see a bank or a medical professional with a patch. Moving on to Athena, she is the goddess of wisdom, but she's also a goddess of war and weaving and many, many others. She is the third of our virginal goddesses. So we have Hestia, we have Artemis, and we have Athena. But unlike the others, Athena does get a child. This is in a story where oh, who is it now? One of the gods attempts to force himself upon her, and he sprays his semen just on the ground. He just can't. He just lets it go, and a child results from it. But she did not give birth to the child. She just fended off this unwanted advance, but then raises the child as her own. So this is a story where her virginity is threatened and she literally fights it off. So the goddess of war aspect kind of comes in. Very, very famously, she is the patron of the city of Athens. There is an Athenian kind of myth about the origin of their city, and the idea was that Poseidon and Athena were fighting over who gets to be the patron of Athens, because Athens is just the best. You can tell the Athenians were the ones who were writing this out. And a contest is had, and Athena is the victor. Poseidon defeated. Very commonly, the imagery that is associated with her, one of them is an aegis. So an aegis is a cloak or a shield, and it depends on the imagery that you're looking at or the text that you are reading, but it is very frequently emblazoned with an image of the Gorgon. So this is Medusa, or Medusa is one of the Gorgons. And so this has protective powers, and an aegis is wielded by both Athena and Zeus can wield it as well. And then owls. Owls are associated with wisdom. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. And if you recall in Hesiod, she was called Owl-Eyed Athena, or the Owl-Eyed goddess. Other names associated with Athena include Pallas and Tritigenia. We saw Tritigenia in Hesiod. And then her Roman name is Minerva. And this is just another image of Athena. We've seen some more. We saw the reconstruction of Athena Parthenos. This would have been a giant statue, massively over life size, that would have been in the Parthenon in Athens on the Acropolis. That's a whole host of terms that I hope you remember. Hephaestus is a god of fire, of craftsmen, and of sculpture. So he is the workman of the Greek world, of the Greek mythological world. And it was Hephaestus who attempted to rape Athena. Okay, so I had these in my notes and I had forgotten. The child that he generated when attempting to force himself upon Athena is called Erichthonius. And if you think you have a better pronunciation than that, please let me know, because that's as good as I'm going to get it. Now, I've got above that, I've got the cat. He was cast out of Olympus, and I think that it was related to his attempted pursuit of Athena, but I can't recall. The most important thing is that it features an art. He gets a victorious return. He returns to Olympus, and it's depicted. There's a parade that's held when he gets to return. Imagery, basically any kind of tool that you can possibly think of. He is a workman. He is a blue-collar worker, and so he gets. And of course, he is also disfigured or deformed in some way. Typically, a lame leg is how he's depicted. And then his Roman name is Vulcan, and this is where we get the word volcano from, because effectively the volcano is the forge of the gods. And you can imagine Hephaestus working away in there, making weapons and armor for the gods. And so here is a depiction of that procession that is bringing Hephaestus back to Mount Olympus. Hephaestus is on the donkey on the left. He's got some workman tools, and his lame leg is draped on, I believe, on the left-hand side there. So what did we do today? We covered over the fact that Zeus rules over everything. And then we covered over what it is that Zeus rules over. I've got an asterisk on the number 12 there because I hopefully went over 13 Olympians, but regardless, the number is set at 12, but who is included in the 12 is often changeable. So just know that there should be 12 Olympians, and all of the Olympians I showed you today fit into that 12. So if you get a question on a quiz or an exam that says put the 12 Olympians in here, you'll know who you can choose from. And that there are more than one generation of Olympians, that some of them gave birth to others. On Friday, we're going to go over some other gods, other divine creatures that are part of Zeus's world, but they don't live on Olympus. They are not Olympians. And then we're also going to introduce semi-divine heroes. These are humans with gods or goddesses as parents, and the heroes will be a new focus as we move beyond the Olympians into the story of Greek heroes.